All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our first lecture of this chapter, and we're going to go ahead and start looking at ecology, what ecology is, how do we organize it in science, and how do we start studying it. So first off, looking at what ecology is, so this is where your notes will start. When we talk about looking at ecology, it's the study of all of the interactions and the relationships that are occurring between organisms as well as the environment that they live in. So we can go ahead and look at how one living organism interacts with another living organism in a specific area. And we can also look at how certain organisms interact with their environment. So depending on the type of climate they live in and the area that they live within. So we're just looking at really interactions between organisms and their environment. Now, when we look at ecology, there's a lot of different levels that we can go ahead and study. And from the smallest level, we can go ahead and look at the individual organism. So we could go ahead and literally just study one single organism. Then we could go a little bit bigger and we could study a population of those organisms. Then we could go a little bit bigger and study a community. And then a little bit bigger, we could study an ecosystem. Little bit bigger, we could study a biome. And then the biggest absolute setting we could study ecology would be the biosphere. And when we're looking at the biosphere, really, again, we're talking about all of Earth. Okay. And we're going to go through each of these levels separately and their definitions. But smallest would be an individual organism. We could study how it interacts and how it lives within its environment. And then all the way to the biggest way we could study ecology would be the biosphere. So there's different categories that we can study ecology and those interactions. And it just depends on what specifically we are looking at in science for which level we're going to study. All right, if we are looking at the single organism level, as it sounds, it is literally just one individual in that group, okay, in that species. So we, in this case, would be just studying what this single moose is doing, okay, looking at how it's living, looking at how it's interacting with its environment. So in a single organism, we would just look at that individual living thing, okay, so single individual within a species. That's our smallest way we can study ecology. Now, if we go up a level, we could go ahead and look at a population. A population is a group of individuals that belong to the same species and that live in the same area. So we're going to go ahead and look at this population or this group of moose and how they live with each other, how they interact with each other, how they interact with their environment. So there is a population. And again, we're also looking at just this group that lives with each other in that same area, because we're not going to look at how different groups of moose live throughout the world when we're studying at the population level. When we're looking at the population level, we're only looking at an individual group in that same area living together and how they interact. Now we can go a little bit bigger and we can look at a community. A community is where we're going to look at how different groups of different populations live together in a defined or specific area. So these are all different organisms that we would see in the Rocky Mountains. Okay, and we could go ahead and look at their different populations and how do they interact with each other. So how does a white-tailed deer interact with the population of moose? Okay, how does the moose interact with the population of wolves? How do they interact with the population of lynx? Okay, how do they interact with the population of bighorned sheep? So we could go ahead and look at how these different populations interact with each other in that specific area of the Rocky Mountains. Who are predators? Who are prey? How do they interact with each other in that same area? Okay, so that's the community. We're looking at how different groups of populations interact. Now, if we go even bigger, an ecosystem, we're going to go ahead and be looking at all the organisms that live in that area, but we're also going to go ahead and start including their physical environment. So now we're going to be looking at things like the mountain ranges. okay, the forests that they live within, what is the average rainfall and the average temperatures. So in an ecosystem, we're not only going to be looking at the different populations and how they interact with each other, but we're all now going to be looking at how they interact with their physical environment as well. Okay, where do they live? Where do they get their water from? What are the temperatures? What is the climate? All right, now even bigger, we can go ahead and look at the biomes. Okay, biomes are groups of ecosystems that share very similar climates and share typical organisms that live within them. So if we look at the world, there are certain biomes spread throughout the world. So for instance, if we go ahead and we look at desert, okay, the desert biome, which you guys can figure desert, hot, dry weather. Okay, the desert biome we see in North America in this area here. Okay, we also see a part of it in South America. Okay, we see a part of it in Africa, and we see a part of it over here in Asia and Australia. So we see a desert biome in different parts of the world. And all that means is that in those areas, they have very similar climates, they have very similar organisms that are living there, and they share those similarities. Okay, same thing when we look at our different other biomes that we might be familiar with. So we see tropical rainforest. Okay, we have tropical rainforests in South America, Africa. Okay, so those are different areas around the world where we see the similar climate and similar organisms living there. And then lastly, our biggest category is biosphere. Okay, biosphere is just all life on Earth, all parts of Earth. So we can go ahead and look at how all of these entities on Earth interact with each other and how they affect each other in their outcomes. So that would be the biosphere. Now, lastly, just looking at how an environment comes together. So when we look at an environment, we're looking at all of those conditions that surround an organism, including both what we call biotic and abiotic factors. So when we talk about looking at an organism's environment or a population's environment, we are looking at biotic factors. Okay, biotic factors are things that are living factors. So biotic factors would be things like the plants, the trees that live within that population of that organism. Okay, also looking at the other living organisms, the other populations, the other animals that might live near that moose. And then we're also going to go ahead and bring in abiotic factors. Abiotic factors are the non-living things. Okay, so those are going to be the things that are our water source, our topography, whether or not there's mountains, okay, whether or not there are plains and grasslands, looking at the weather and the climate. Those are going to be all of our non-living factors. So when we look at an environment and we're studying ecology, okay, the environment is going to include not only those living organisms, but also we're looking at how it interacts with both the living and the non-living things within its environment. Okay, so that's both biotic and abiotic factors. This A in front of the biotic tells us non or without. Okay, so abiotic factors, non-living things. So if we look at this moose here, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to study this individual organism, this moose, we're going to go ahead and we're going to be looking at how is it interacting with everything in its environment. Okay, so we're going to be looking at how is it interacting with the grasses nearby? How is it interacting with the trees nearby? Okay, how is it interacting with the water source? Okay, or the mountains that it's near. So we're going to be looking at all these different things compared to, what does it eat? What does it consume? And where does it live? Okay, so we're going to look at its entire environment, living and non-living. All right, so that about wraps it up for this lecture. It's a nice short one, and we will go ahead and reinforce those different levels of organization of how we can study ecology and what they include. And we'll also talk a little bit more about abiotic and biotic factors. So as always, if you guys have questions, make sure you ask them in class. Have a good day.